What if your entire life, your hopes, your body, your destiny, was decided before you even understood what those words meant? Imagine being barely 12 years old, still clinging to childhood games, and already someone's wife, someone's possession, someone's bargaining chip in a cold political deal made behind palace walls. For women in the medieval world, this wasn't a nightmare. It was Tuesday. This was life. There were no dreams to chase, no ambitions to fight for, only orders to obey and wounds to fill. You belonged to your father until you belonged to your husband, and if you had a crown on your head, that didn't mean you were free. It just meant your cage was gilded. The world outside was brutal, but for women, even the home could be a battlefield. The church preached that you were weak, sinful by nature, the daughters of Eve, temptresses, liabilities, inferior by divine design. Empower you? Never. Protect you? Only if it served God, or more accurately, men who claimed to speak for him. And so from the moment a girl could stand, she was already being groomed to kneel. The Dark Ages. They didn't earn that name because the sun stopped shining. They were dark because knowledge was lost. Science silenced, compassion corrupted. 1,000 years of superstition reigning where reason had once stood tall. And within this darkness, girls were forced to become women far too soon, and women were forced to become martyrs without sainthood. Picture the cold stone corridors of a 12th century castle. The air smells of damp linen, burning tallow, and fear. In the center of it all, a girl, barely 13, is being adorned in ceremonial silk, her hair braided with trembling hands, her body scrubbed raw in preparation. Not for a celebration, not for joy. For marriage, she will be given to a man she barely knows, perhaps thrice her age, perhaps already a monster. But no one asks her. No one dares. Her future has been sold, and her body, now a political tool, is about to be tested. Her name might be Bridget, like Saint Bridget of Sweden, wed at 13, or maybe Matilda, daughter of Henry I. Shipped off to a foreign court at 12, Eleanor of Provence gave birth at 16, not because she chose to be a mother, but because royalty demanded it. These weren't isolated horrors. They were the norm. And if a noblewoman wasn't married by 19, she was whispered about, pitied, even ridiculed, an old maid, a social failure, her worth dwindling like an unsold relic. Margaret of York was labeled too old at that age, an idea that today feels nothing short of madness. But back then, time was cruel, and girlhood was fleeting. And don't be fooled into thinking royal life meant luxury. It meant scrutiny, it meant duty, and it meant pain cloaked in pearls. Yes, they had servants, but childbirth does not spare queens. Puerperal fever didn't ask whether you wore a crown, and the grim math of the time was simple. Have as many children as possible, because most of them would die. A woman's legacy was not measured in wisdom or wit, but in surviving childbirth and producing heirs. Each pregnancy was a spin of a loaded gun. If she survived labor, her duties resumed, tending the household, managing servants, keeping the fire burning. Letting that fire go out wasn't just inconvenient, it could mean freezing to death, no safety net, and forget antibiotics. If the umbilical cord turned, if the baby came feet first, if the bleeding wouldn't stop, there was no saving her, just prayers. And silence. Labor could last for days, weeks, breech births, fatal. C-sections were done, yes, but only when the mother was already dying or dead. There were no clean incisions, no recovery rooms, only agony and guesses. Some women screamed through birth with no help but superstition. Others died quietly, their names forgotten even before the candles burned out. The church taught that this suffering was holy, that it was woman's burden, woman's curse. But where was the mercy? Where was the salvation for girls who never chose any of it? And what of those who weren't married? If a noble family lacked the wealth for a dowry, the girl might be sent to a convent. But don't picture peace and prayer. Picture isolation, exile, a silent, cloistered burial of potential, not out of piety, but practicality. A daughter tucked away like a stain on family honor. And those who rebelled, who refused obedience, their stories rarely end well. If a husband was cruel, there was no escape. Divorce was a heresy. Legal protection didn't exist. A wife's body belonged to her husband, her will, her voice, her life. And what about the common women, the peasants, the midwives? Their lives were often harder still, working from sunrise to dusk, birthing children in straw-lined corners, surviving on broth and bread crusts. They endured the same pain, the same losses, with even less support. They didn't get portraits. They didn't get remembered. But they bled, and they wept, and they fought to keep their children alive, with nothing but instinct and scraps. In every corner of medieval Europe, the female body was a battlefield, and the war never ceased. Menstrual cycles were rare not because of better health, but because women were almost constantly pregnant. Birth control, a sin. Education, denied. Autonomy, a fantasy. Even queens were pawns, moved by kings and fathers like lifeless tokens in games of war and alliance. The history books praised the marriages of kings. Treaties sealed with kisses, but rarely speak of the young girls who were offered up like sacrifices. Royal weddings were spectacles, but the honeymoon? That was often a bloodstain and a prayer. Women who dared to think, to write, to speak out, like Hildegard of Bingen or Christine de Pizan, were rare and often dismissed. Their words were drowned in centuries of obedience and fear. And yet they lived. They endured. Some even found power in the cracks, managing estates, influencing courts from behind veils, passing wisdom in hushed whispers beneath stone arches. Their stories are whispers too, but listen closely and you'll hear them. The world they lived in was colder, darker, crueler, but somehow they survived, not because they were weaker, but because they were stronger than anyone ever gave them credit for. This was the reality of womanhood in the medieval world. A crown on your head didn't mean freedom. It just meant your cage was lined with velvet. And the bars? They were made of tradition, religion, silence, and fear. Imagine waking up in a stone like smoke. Your limbs ache, your stomach turns, and you can already sense what's coming. The sickness, the blood, the ache in your bones that tells you another child is on its way. No rest, no recovery, just the relentless rhythm of reproduction. This was the reality for women of the Middle Ages. Bodies used, spirits tested, pain expected. And yet, the real horror isn't just what they endured, it's how their suffering was normalized, spiritualized, even celebrated. You see, childbirth wasn't just a biological event, it was a religious trial, a divine punishment. The pain of labor was seen as Eve's curse, a necessary penance for the sin of being born female. If you died giving birth, that was God's will. If you survived, prepare to do it all over again. And the church? It offered no mercy, only ritual. Priests would sometimes refuse communion to pregnant women unless they confessed their sins. A stillbirth could be interpreted as divine judgment, and if a woman died in childbirth before being properly churched, a purification rite held weeks after giving birth. There were whispers that her soul might not rest. Her agony didn't end with death. It followed her into legend, into theology, into fear. But the body wasn't the only battleground. The mind was too. Women were deliberately kept ignorant, denied formal education, forbidden to read Latin, excluded from universities. A curious woman was a dangerous woman. A literate woman, practically a witch. And yes, witchcraft. Let's talk about that. Because as time went on, especially into the late medieval period, the grip of fear tightened. Women who healed with herbs, who delivered babies, who knew too much. Suddenly they weren't midwives, they were heretics, witches. The church turned suspicion into policy, and entire communities turned on the very women who had once nursed them through fevers and brought their children into the world. It didn't take much. A neighbor's illness, a failed crop, a child who died in the night. Someone needed to blame someone, and the easiest target? A woman. Old, widowed, childless, outspoken, intelligent, helpful. Any of these could be grounds for accusation. And when the inquisitors came, they didn't ask questions. They tortured until the women confessed. To flying, to dancing with the devil, to cursing cows and poisoning bread. The confessions didn't matter. The sentence was always the same: death, fire, rope, stones. These executions weren't swift or quiet. They were public spectacles meant to terrify the rest. A warning: step out of line, and this is your fate. Be quiet, be obedient, be afraid. And in this climate of fear, even royal women weren't safe. Take Joan of Navarre, Queen of England, accused of witchcraft by her own stepson. Why? Because she was powerful, because she had money, because she had influence. It wasn't about spells, it was about silencing her. Then there was Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, beautiful, clever, politically savvy. She was accused of sorcery and imprisoned for the rest of her life. The truth? She dared to have a voice. That was her crime. But the manipulation of women's bodies and minds didn't always come with fire and iron. Sometimes it came with velvet gloves. Soft control, the way girls were raised to think their highest aspiration was to please. The way women were praised only for their silence, their piety, their pain. Even love was poisoned. Courtly romance, so often romanticized today, was rarely pure. These were songs and stories written by men for other men, idealizing women as unattainable objects of devotion or symbols of purity, never as human beings. A woman was to inspire, not to speak, to be admired, not to desire. Her worth was in her chastity, her stillness, her silence. If she loved, it had to be secret. If she desired, she was dangerous. This toxic ideal spread like wildfire, shaping the very language of love, literature, of life. And still, through all of it, through torture, childbirth, exile, and silence, women resisted. In quiet ways, in dangerous ways, in clever ways. Some took control of estates when their husbands died, using their widowhood as freedom. Others joined convents not as punishment but as sanctuary, where they could learn, write, even teach. Some disguised themselves as men to study or travel. Others wrote poetry, songs, philosophy, hiding behind pen names or slipping their manuscripts through friendly hands. One such woman was Christine de Pizan, a widow, a mother, a scholar. She wrote the Book of the City of Ladies, challenging the idea that women were naturally inferior. Her words were revolutionary. If it were customary to send little girls to school and teach them the same subjects as are taught to boys, they would learn as thoroughly. In a world that told her she was worth less, she wrote her worth into history. And there were others. Hildegard of Bingen, an abbess, composer, healer, visionary. She corresponded with emperors, dictated divine revelations, and composed haunting music that still echoes through cathedrals today. She wasn't just allowed to speak, she was listened to. How? Because she cloaked her genius in faith, wrapped her truth in holy visions. Even in chains, some found ways to move. Even in silence, they spoke. But most did not leave legacies. Most were mothers and midwives, laborers and lovers, whose names are lost to time. Their histories were not written, they were endured. They lived in shadows, in margins, in bloodlines, and they carried more than just children. They carried pain. They carried hope. They carried the unbearable truth of what it meant to be a woman in a world built by men. And maybe, in some small way, they carried each other. asked knowledge in whispered prayers, shared herbs and remedies behind locked doors, taught daughters how to survive without ever saying the word survival. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest thing of all. Not just the suffering, but the silence. The erasure. The idea that none of this happened, that women were just there, background characters in history's grand stage. But they weren't. They were the breath of that world, the lifeblood of a civilization that did everything it could to control them. Without them, kingdoms crumbled. Without them, none of it stood. So the next time you picture the Middle Ages, don't just imagine knights and castles. Imagine a girl lighting a fire in the freezing dark, terrified it will go out. Imagine a young woman clutching her swollen belly, praying not to die tonight. Imagine a widow counting coins, deciding whether to eat or warm the room. Imagine a midwife wrapping a stillborn child, whispering a blessing through tears. These were the women who truly built history, not with swords but with strength, not in battles but in blood, not in chronicles but in the quiet, enduring defiance of simply surviving. Now picture this, a cold stone monastery on a fog-drenched hill, its bell tolling in the gray stillness of dawn. Inside, cloaked figures chant in low, echoing voices, but behind one of those veils is a woman who never wanted to be here. She was not called to God. She was sent by a father who couldn't afford a dowry, by a brother who needed to marry for land, by a family eager to erase the burden of her existence. For so many women in the medieval world, the convent was not a holy refuge. It was a silent prison, a place to vanish, to be forgotten, to live without scandal. You were no longer a daughter, sister, or wife. You became a ghost in God's house, bound not by chains, but by duty. You woke in the dark, worked in the cold, prayed in the silence, and died in the shadows. No grave, no legacy, just another name erased by history's indifference. But even within those convent walls, women sometimes found the only power they were allowed, a sliver of space where men would not look too closely. In these cloisters, they copied manuscripts, preserved knowledge, even wrote subversive texts cloaked in theology. They taught other girls to read, they studied the stars, they practiced herbal medicine. Some found sisterhood, others found madness, and many found both. Yet even these thin freedoms could be stripped away at the whim of a bishop, a king, or a scandal. Because, make no mistake, no matter how pious or educated a woman became, her worth was always weighed against obedience. Step too far, speak too loudly, and she was no longer a nun. She was a heretic. And her end was no different than a witch's. Fire, stone, shame. Outside the cloister, the world continued its brutal rhythm. Women aged fast in the Middle Ages. A girl of 12 was a bride. A woman of 30 was considered old. By 40, you were often widowed or worn. And if you lived beyond that, your wisdom was more feared than honored. Post-menopausal women, no longer useful for childbirth, were often viewed with suspicion. They had outlived their purpose in a world obsessed with fertility. If they knew healing, they were witches. If they lived alone, they were dangerous. If they dared to speak freely, they were condemned. These women were the forgotten, the discarded, and in some towns, they were hunted. Imagine now a village in Bavaria. A strange illness has swept through, children dying, cows turning ill, bread spoiling. The people are terrified. The priest preaches about sin, about evil walking among them. The townsfolk gathered torches. A name is whispered. She's old. She lives alone. She talks to herself. She once helped birth a baby that died. That's all it takes. They come for her at night, drag her into the street. She doesn't scream. She's too shocked. She's chained in the square, accused of dancing with the devil, of cursing their fields. She pleads, she prays, it doesn't matter. The trial is a show. The verdict already written. She burns at dawn, and the townspeople watch, children in their arms, convinced that the fire will cleanse them of fear, that they've killed the darkness, but they haven't. They've only killed another woman brave enough to live outside their control. Yet not all defiance was punished with fire. Some women became queens, regents, warriors, and though they were rare, their stories crack the stone silence of history like a chisel. Eleanor of Aquitaine married 2 kings, birthed 10 children, joined a crusade, and ruled lands from England to the Pyrenees. She defied church, crown, and custom, but even she was imprisoned by her husband for daring to rebel. Then there was Isabella of France, wife of Edward II. When her husband failed to rule, she orchestrated a coup with her lover, overthrew the king, and ruled England as regent for her son. They call her the she-wolf, not queen, not ruler, she-wolf, because when a woman wielded power, she was never just strong, she was monstrous. And yet, these monsters often governed better than their male counterparts. They balanced brutal politics with subtle diplomacy, negotiated peace, protected their children's thrones, but their accomplishments were rewritten as cautionary tales. Ambition became betrayal, intelligence became deceit, power became perversion. History, after all, was written by men. Still, women adapted, manipulated the rules from within. Some used their beauty as a weapon, like Agnes Sorel, the mistress of Charles VII, who became so influential she was blamed for state affairs. Some used motherhood, like Blanche of Castile, who ruled France in her son's name and kept the kingdom from collapse. Others used faith, like Catherine of Siena, whose visions gave her enough clout to counsel popes and kings. They weren't allowed to lead, so they led anyway, through back doors, through whispers, through shadows. But each step forward came with risk. One wrong word, one political loss, one shift in court favor, and it could all vanish. Even queens could be executed. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Margaret Pole, their crowns did not save them. And through it all, through 1,000 years of oppression, pain, and silence, women kept going. They held the line, held their families, held their sanity in a world built to unmake them. They carved love from arranged marriages, carved purpose from forced motherhood, carved legacy from lives that were never meant to be remembered. And in the margins of crumbling manuscripts, in forgotten prayers, in the scarred bones of plague victims and battlefield widows, their stories still echo. These were not weak women. These were women stronger than the world allowed them to be. Women who endured childbirth in candlelit corners, who scraped together food from barren earth, who taught their daughters to read in secret. Women who bore pain as if it were a second soul, who survived not because they were protected, but because they were unbreakable. Their stories matter, not because they are rare, but because they are common. Their suffering was not the exception, it was the rule. And yet, against all odds, they lived. So next time someone tells you the past was simpler, remember this: the Middle Ages were not romantic. They were raw, they were ruthless, and for women, they were a crucible. Every girl born into that world carried a question she would never be allowed to ask. What could I have been if I had been free? But maybe the darkest truth of all is this: we don't know how many dreams were lost, how many stories were never told, how many lives began and ended in silence. Because history didn't forget these women. It chose to erase them, and now, centuries later, we must choose to remember.